My friend Nikki Haley has had a remarkable career as the governor of South Carolina and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President Donald Trump. Throughout her service to America, Ambassador Haley has been bold, courageous, and tenacious in the face of adversity. We sat together to discuss how she developed her strength growing up and how the culture of victimhood robs people of their potential. We agreed, it's time women redefined the feminist movement. It's been on my bucket list to sit down with you and talk to you, mainly because I feel like we really have so much in common, and I hope I don't sound like arrogant or presumptuous by saying that, because obviously you're so much more accomplished than I am. You know, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and governor and all the things that you've accomplished. But I want to ask you a little bit about these values that I think we have in common. You know, you talk in your book about tenacity, you talk about adversity. I mean, so many of these things that I like to talk about too. Where did you get those values from?
So we were the only Indian family in a small southern town, 2,500 people, 2 stoplights. You couldn't think about doing something wrong without somebody telling your mom. And because we were the only Indian family, my father at the time wore a turban. He still does to this day. My mother wore a sari. They didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. And I remember when I would get teased on the playground and I would come home and my mom would say, your job is not to show them how you're different. Your job is to show them how you're similar. And so it's amazing how that lesson on the playground played out throughout my life, whether it was in the corporate world, whether it was as governor, whether it was as ambassador, because when you're faced with a challenge, if you first talk about the things you have in common, people let their guard down, and then you can go towards a solution. And so I think that I've just been like that all my life, from the fact that times were hard as we were growing up, but you learn to survive and make the best of it. And you learn to kind of do harder work to get people to understand where you were coming from. And so it's worked out that way. I remember as a young girl always looking to see where the women leaders were, and I didn't see any. Mm-hmm. And in second grade, I would go check out books in the library, and the only women's books were on first ladies. And so I would read their autobiographies and I'd find out how much they were partners to their husbands and how much they moved the country behind the scenes and did things like that. And so that's why I went and wrote this book, is because I very much wanted girls, women, young professionals, mothers, grandmothers to be able to see inspiring stories of ordinary women who became extraordinary.
One of the things I feel like we have in common is the way we deal with adversity and this idea of victimhood, which I think is kind of different from the narrative that we're seeing in our culture, certainly the narrative that we're seeing in many schools and education, where people are kind of forced to identify as some sort of victim and allow that victim mentality to shackle them. I grew up with, a fair share of adversity as well. My parents divorced when I was really young. My mom raised me, and I could have really used this as a reason to be kind of like weak and or whatever it is that you would hear in society. But I actually feel like it gave me calluses. And so I have this phrase that I say, kiss your calluses, because I think it strengthened mine. And when I read in your book about how you handled your adversity, I found that to be really exciting and inspiring.
Well, and a lot of what I talk about in the book is what feminism really is. Feminism shouldn't be about women being victims. We don't need quotas. We don't need anyone to feel sorry for us. When given an opportunity, women work hard and prove they deserve to be in the room. Every time. And so the key, what I want to see from young women growing up is don't complain about it, do something about it. And when you get the opportunity, make sure whatever you do, you're great at it and that people remember you for it. That's the key, is we're not victims. We just need to show why we deserve to be in the room. And I think when we do, we shine.
What kind of adversity did you go through as a child that you feel has given you the tools to succeed today as an adult?
I think that when you've been bullied, you're more sensitive to others that are bullied, but you also gain a strength with it. So you learn to use it for good. And so I think that's why, as governor, I really focused on how we lifted up the rural challenged parts of the state, how we helped those kids and said that, they needed an education, not based on where they were born and raised, but on the fact that they deserved a good education. And when I got to the United Nations. It's why I fought so hard for Israel. It's because I saw them being bullied on the world stage, and I saw the fact that this was a bright spot in a tough neighborhood, and they didn't deserve what they were getting. And so I think that those adversities really actually helped me better understand the pain that other people feel and want to empower them to get through that and to push through it and to come out stronger on the other side.
When you were working at the United Nations, you were kind of different. Your beliefs were very different, but your childhood kind of built you to be that person who's different. And so what was that like?
Well, I think there's never been any lines to the women's bathroom in any of the jobs I've had. I was the first female executive in a company, and then I was the first female minority governor in the country. And then at the United Nations, I was the only woman on the Security Council. So I never let that be a factor. I just was the only, but that didn't mean anything. I let them know that I was going to work hard, that I knew what I was doing. And when I went to the United Nations, it was very much, I wanted other countries to know what the United States was for and what they were against. I didn't care if they liked me, but I wanted them to respect America. In all of those positions, they were all hard. None of them were easy, but life isn't fun if it's easy. You want to work hard to make a difference, and you want to do it in a way that you lift up everybody, not just a certain segment of the population.
Going into the United Nations, I'm assuming you had a certain vision of what it would be like. I know I have a vision of it, a vision of it maybe being gone or something. But once you started working there, were you surprised in any way?
I was, because I didn't really know much about the United Nations. I just knew that everybody hated it, right? And so, but I purposely didn't study the do's and don'ts of the UN. I wanted to go in with fresh eyes. I wanted to be able to ask for forgiveness. So every day it felt like I was putting on body armor. We knew there was going to be a fight. We just didn't know which country we were going to fight that day. But I really wanted to push the United Nations to be more than it was. They were so used to talking about old, archaic conversations, bashing on Israel. That was what they loved to do. I wanted them to talk about things that were uncomfortable to talk about. I wanted them to talk about human rights. I wanted them to talk about what Syria was doing and how they were using chemical weapons. I wanted China to be called out for human rights abuses. I wanted, Russia to be called out for their invasion of Ukraine. All of those things were, I just really pushed the envelope to get them to talk about those things. And, when I left the United Nations, I told the ambassadors and the Secretary General that if they want the United Nations to be relevant, they've got to start talking about things that are uncomfortable to talk about. I wanted to make sure, one, I was doing the job for the American people and defending the country that I love so much.
One of the things that you mention in your book, which is probably one of my favorite quotes from Ronald Reagan, is that Jeane Kirkpatrick took the kick me sign off America's back. And I feel like you kind of did the same thing. And I wish pretty much every person who is serving America in public service should put a sign back on their back saying, I am here to protect America, right? I think you successfully did that.
Well, you look at this national self-loathing that's happening in our country. I mean, it's killing us. The idea that they're saying we're an oppressed country, that we're a racist country, that, we're bad. We're not. If we were a racist country, I never would have been elected the first female minority governor. We need to teach our children to love America. We need to remember what it's like to fight for America. I look at the Ukrainians and see what they're doing in this war. And we used to fight for America that much. We used to be that passionate for America. We've got to get that back, because the rest of the world is looking at us going, what happened? And we look so distracted right now. And when America's distracted, the world is less safe. And so we really need to understand how blessed we are. I mean, the United Nations ambassadors would take me to the side, and they would talk about how they loved the fact that we had freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to do and be anything we wanted to be without government getting in the way. I mean, what I saw is when America spoke, the world listened. When America led, the world followed. Who we are, the world wanted to be. And I think we've got to find that back again.
How do you think we got here? How did we get to a point where we're actually championing elected officials that are poo-pooing on America? How did we get to this point?
I think you just saw the left getting further and further left, wanting to victimize. So it was a whole series of victimization and labeling. And, everybody's tried to label me for different things. I'm so much more than a label, and every person is more than a label. And you see it with critical race theory that, if you've got a little girl going into kindergarten, if she's white, you're telling her she's bad. If she's brown or black, you're telling her she's never going to be good enough and she's always going to be a victim. That's not the way we want to raise our kids. It's abusive. Florida passed that bill that said, you can't talk about gender until third grade. Mm-hmm. That's too early. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't have sex ed until 7th grade. And even then, your parents had to sign the permission slip and my dad wouldn't sign it.
And
so I was the uncool
was a
kid.
Completely different thing when you were a kid and when I were a kid and what we're seeing now in sex ed. I mean, talk about the goalpost moving.
Well, and you're confusing children. They shouldn't have to wonder if they're a girl or a boy. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't have to wonder if they're gay or straight. They shouldn't have to wonder if their color matters on how they're going to be treated. In America, the way my parents always told us was, you could be anything you want to be if you work hard and you put your mind to it. That's how we want to raise our children. That's who we want to know that's going to lead our country going forward. Not a bunch of victims who are looking at labels. Not a bunch of cliques that are going to cancel you if you don't look or sound like them. And that's how far we've gone to the left. But now we have to right the ship. And I think it starts in our schools. We need parents being loud. If you see something wrong, say something about it. The parents' groups can be so much bigger than the teachers' unions. And we've got to understand we have one job, and that's to raise our kids. And we've got to get it right. And it's not going to be good for our kids if we're just going along with the flow of what the teachers' unions tell us. We've really got to fight back and make sure that we're fighting for our children because they deserve it.
You talk about how at the United Nations, you felt like every day you would go there and you would fight for something. You just didn't know what you would be fighting about. It sounds so exhausting. I feel that way sometimes even here at PragerU. I mean, one day it's critical race theory. Mm-hmm. Another day it's ESG. Another day it's the sexualization of our children. It's an onslaught from every single direction. How did you navigate through that just exhaustion?
I think when you're passionate, you don't get exhausted. Because we don't have time to be exhausted. That was always the way I looked at it. And I was up for the challenge. And I was ready to fight as much as I needed to fight. And I was ready to help them understand what they needed to understand. And, it got to where they trusted what I was saying. They knew what we were doing. They didn't have to like it, but they knew that I was telling them the truth. And I think that we have to remember that it's easy to just shout back and hate on a group that doesn't think like us. Mm-hmm. It's harder and smarter to communicate with them, to hear where they're coming from so that you know how to best tell your story back to them. And so learning to communicate in a way that moves the ball forward is so much better than communicating a way that just further divides or hates the other side.
Mm-hmm. Something we have in common sometimes gets me in trouble, and that is I'm not a yes woman. One of the things you write about is that when Donald Trump hired you, you had a condition.
Yes.
And I want to talk a little bit about that and talk about how sometimes that can get us into trouble, and is it worth it?
First, I think that women especially, when they're faced with a challenge, they tend to step back. And I think what's really important is you have to learn to push through the fear. If you push through the fear, you find out how much stronger you are on the other side. So if I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have defeated the longest serving legislator in South Carolina. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have run for governor. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have accepted the position of ambassador. So when you push through the fear, you live life. But the more important part is when you do push through the fear, set yourself up for success. So when he asked me to be ambassador, I said, well, I've been governor. I don't want to work for anyone else. I would want to work directly with you, so I'd have to be a cabinet position. He said, done. I said, well, I'm a policy girl, so I'd want to be in the room when decisions are made, so I need to be on the National Security Council. He said, done. And I said, well, I'm not going to be a wallflower or a talking head. I need to be able to say what I think. And he said, Nikki, that's exactly why I want you to do this. And he was true to his word from the first day to the last day. You have to set yourself up for success and then just go and prove what you're made of. And I knew I needed those 3 things in order to be successful. And I think that that's really important when you take on a challenge like that.
So you did it in the UN. Mm-hmm. You certainly faced a whole group of people who did not want to hear what you had to say.
Right.
Did you ever push back against the president, and did he listen?
Anytime you have a leader and you work for someone, you can't stop them being who they are. And if they have a goal, your job is to help them achieve it. but you got to make sure the way they go about it is right. And so a lot of times it would be, I knew that maybe it would be construed differently if he went the direction he was going, or if I thought the policy was wrong. And he always listened. We always had a conversation. Didn't mean I won all the time, but it did mean that we had a really good working relationship.
I really appreciate that, because I think if you want people like us, people who are willing to go and fight for you, we're going to have a fighting spirit. And you should be okay with the fact that our fighting spirit is sometimes going to be something that you might not be in lockstep with all the time.
And you know, President Trump appreciated that about me. He loved the fact that I would call him out. He loved the fact that I would put more ideas in front of him. And I did that to him because that's what I wanted when I was governor. With my cabinet, I would tell all of them, I want you to be creative. I want you to serve the people. And thirdly, if you see me doing something wrong, say it. And I think that's really important for any leaders, to make sure they don't just have yes men around them, but that they have people who will really challenge them and push back if they see something's wrong.
So much of what we need to see, especially right now in America, is people who get things done, right?
Yes.
Like, you get things done. But in order to get things done, you can't be in fear all the time of every single word you're going to say or every single thing you're going to do, right? And so for us to be fearless and courageous and strong, and we can't be, yes people all the time. And I love that you do that. I love that you write about it in the book. One of your opening chapters in the book is about Golda Meir, who is the Prime Minister of Israel. She talks about the phrase that you borrowed from her, en brera, which basically means, what other choice do we have? We have no choice. We have to fight for our country. And when we realize that we have no other choice, we fight with all our might. We really mean it.
Her parents really just wanted her to get married and be happy, and she knew she was meant for more than that. And so when she saw what happened with the Holocaust, she very much wanted to make sure that the Jewish people would never be dependent on anyone else. And so she pushed and was, one of the founders of Israel. But even in the wars as they happened, she would go out and raise massive amounts of money so that Israel could defend itself. I mean, she was the ultimate problem solver. She never looked to anyone else to do something, and she never said no. She just always kept moving for the greater good. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that, which is, when you're not dependent on anyone else, the only person you have left to trust is yourself, and trust your gut. Because I think our guts always tell us the right thing to do. And you can't listen to the voices, and especially the negative voices that tell you can't or why you shouldn't. You just have to go with where your gut tells you.
There's a story that I share sometimes about my childhood. So I was born in the United States, but I was raised in Israel. And around, I think I was like 13 or 14 years old, the school took me to Yad Vashem Museum, the Holocaust Museum. And I'm pretty young, and I remember walking through those dark hallways and seeing the piles of shoes and the burnt books and the pictures of the emaciated people and all of that. And I couldn't utter a word, which is not very like me, because I oftentimes have a strong reaction to something. And I was just quiet the entire time. Eventually, I made it to the end of this hallway, and I saw a docent by the door, and there was a little light above her. And I walked up to her, and I said, "How come nobody stopped this?" And I think they put the docent there to respond to this question that probably anybody who went through the exhibit had.
Right.
And she looks back at me and she says, "Young lady, most people rely on other people to fight. And by the time people start fighting, it's oftentimes too late."
It's so true.
And that really ignited a fire in me, because I see that. I just, people are seeing that our own children are being targeted right now. I mean, just the other day, I read that the American Medical Association is actually going to go after people who are questioning giving puberty blockers and doing castrations or transgender surgeries on children. And if you even question it, now it's going to be considered disinformation, and they're going to come after us. And so how do we not fight? But people are either afraid to fight, they're waiting for other people to fight, and just how do we infuse this fighting spirit back in our own country so that we don't lose this place?
Well, I think they think that their voice won't matter, but every voice matters. Sometimes standing alone is hard. But there are other people waiting to stand with you. In the book, I talk about Virginia Walden Ford, and she was someone who she was raising her son in a crime-ridden area of Washington, D.C., and she just wanted a better education for her son. The schools were bad. And so she started to fight, and she didn't have the money to put her son in a private school. And through all that, she pushed for school choice in Washington, D.C. And the amazing part is she had a terrible fear of public speaking. But she started to rally people, just herself as a single mom, went before Congress, and because of her, not just her son benefited, but thousands of children were able to have a better educational opportunity just because of one person. And this book is full of all of stories of just one person who had that extra will to say, I'm not going to be okay with this. And we have to remember, we all have that. We all have to push hard. Everybody knows Rosa Parks refused to get off the bus. And she's iconic and a hero for that way. But what they don't know is 9 months prior, a 15-year-old girl was the original one that refused to get off the bus. She was studying the Constitution in school. And when they told her to get off the bus, she said, no, it's my constitutional right. She was arrested. They put her in jail. She didn't have the support of anyone, but she did it because that was her gut. That was what she knew she had to stand up for something, but she sent off a movement. And so we have to speak up. We have to use the power of our voices because they're strong, and you never know who's hearing you, and you never know who'll join you, but you can't ever just being the only one be the reason you don't do it. That's all the more reason why you should do it.
Do you have any fears? How do you overcome your fears? You just seem so fearless to me.
I think everybody has fears, but I have taught myself to push through them. I just think it's really important that fears are not, you should never step back from a fear. You should lean into it and you should do something about it. Otherwise, you're living in chaos. But when you push through it, that's how you suddenly find out, one, your strength, but you get to, the solution of it. A personal example was after I left the UN, I've always had this inability to be comfortable. I always have to put myself in uncomfortable situations. And so I told myself that I could not run. And so I started running. And last December, I ran a half marathon. And, that was something where it was scary. It was scary to think about running 13.1 miles. It was scary to think, can I train for it? Will I be able to do it? I don't want to fail, all of those things. But I just pushed through the fear and trusted myself. And, what you find in running is it's not your body that can't do it. It's your mind that tells your body you can't do it. And our brains are so powerful. They try and save us from ourselves. Sometimes you got to push your brain out and say, no, I can do it. And that's the key to making sure that you kind of constantly give back and do for yourself and do for others.
I so relate to the story of Virginia because I could not give a public speech for the life of me. 11 years ago when I started working with Dennis Prager, the deal was he does the public speaking, I run the company. And as PragerU grew, part of my responsibility became giving some public speeches. And my first public speech, I was sandwiched between Dennis Prager and former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And it was
intimidating.
I think I have PTSD to date on that one. And eventually I got better, I hope, and I kind of got over it. But I think what you say is so true, is so much of it is in our mental capacity to just expand our limits. And once we do it, the first time, the second time, the third time, your body becomes more comfortable doing these things and you get better at it.
The more you do it, the less intimidating it becomes. And some people run from that and say, I just can't. But when you lean into it, not only do you do it, but you inspire others to do it as well.
I think the fear of failure is something also that people need to get comfortable with. And even failing is okay, right?
It's a lesson.
It's actually worse when you don't try. But the fact that I gave that speech and I failed at it actually built those calluses that enabled me to go up there again, because I said to myself, okay, I failed at that one, but I'm not going to give up on myself. And I actually think that when young people are taught that it's okay to try things that they might fail at, I mean, maybe that first time that you're running, you lose your breath after 5 minutes, but then you don't give up and you keep going at it again. I think so many young people are taught, well, you got to get a participation trophy no matter what. And so if we teach kids that failure is okay and it's part of those steps up the ladder to get to where you need to go, then people will be more equipped to keep trying and eventually succeed.
And they're lessons learned. And if you go look at Margaret Thatcher, she's a grocer's daughter. She was often made fun of. She was underestimated. But as much as she believed in Britain, she believed in herself. Mm-hmm. That was the key to Margaret Thatcher, which she believed in herself, and she didn't need anyone else to believe in her because she knew the direction she was going, and she knew if she could get that done, that people would be better. And so believing in ourselves is really important now more than ever when you have the leftist groups all telling us that we're wrong and we're bad and, all of these other things. No, we're not. Because we love our children and because we think their education should be a certain way and because we look at different issues on whether it's spending or crime or the border, that doesn't make us bad. It just means we have an opinion. Mm-hmm. But it's also the reason our elected officials can't just go say their opinion on TV. Mm-hmm. They've got to do something. Mm-hmm. You've got to get some results. And I worry about that now is we've got a bunch of talking heads that love to talk about it, but they're not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And, we've got to be a country that gets back to work again.
I know that you left the United Nations because you were kind of taking a break from, public service. You're probably sick of this question, but can we get you back into public service? Are you considering helping save America again?
Well, I think right now I've been focused on a lot of campaigns, House, Senate. We've got 36 governor's races, so I've been all over the country campaigning for them because I think if we don't win in November, there is no 2024. But I'm telling all of those candidates as well that winning is half the battle. Proving we deserve to be there is the more important half of the battle. And then I don't need to make another decision until January. If it looks like there's a place for me, I've never lost a race, I'm not going to start now. We'll put 1,000% in and we'll finish it. If there's not a place for me, I've fought for this country as long as I can remember, and I'll do it until my last breath.
I don't think I got here because of the diversity of my gender, but really because of my merit and my hard work. And I personally find it really challenging when we're living in a society that is telling women that unless there are diversity quotas, we can't really make it. Do you have any thoughts on this new wave of feminism that is taking us down as women?
Yeah, and we don't want to be here because of a quota. We don't want to be here because somebody felt sorry for us. We don't want to be here and resented because they said, oh, it's time for us to promote a woman instead of a man. Mm-hmm. No, we want to be where we are because we earned it. And, it goes back to when I first got out of college. I was an accounting supervisor for a company and 6 of its subsidiaries, and I was the only woman on the executive board. And one day the CEO was running late. We were having a meeting. CEO was running late, and he comes in and he apologizes to everyone. And the CFO looked at me and said, Nikki, why don't you go get Paul a cup of coffee? And I remember thinking at the time, I didn't know how I was going to handle it, but how I handled it was going to dictate how they treated me going forward. And I said, absolutely. And I leaned over to the phone in the middle of the table and I called my assistant and I said, Kim, will you please get Paul a cup of coffee? They never asked me to get coffee again, but I didn't have to embarrass anybody. I didn't have to pitch a fit. All I needed to do was show them the right way to do it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people don't know. So don't forget the idea that we also have to show them how they should be acting with women or how they should be treating women. And then when you're given an opportunity, which we should ask for, if there's an opportunity we see, go in there and tell them you want it. And when you do it, go prove you deserve to be in the room. That's what real feminism is. Mm-hmm. It's our strength, it's our spirit, it's the perfectionist side of women. That's what we need to do. We don't need to scream about it and beg for things. We're better than that. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to see our girls get used to that either.
I always like to think of us as we're not the same, but we are equal. And so
we're just wired different.
Right? And so if we want to have equal opportunities, it doesn't mean that we need to demand equal results. I mean, I see in my own behavior to want to be mom, and oftentimes that means that I might take one less business trip, or I might not be okay with working late every single night because I want to be in my children's lives. And so 2 questions. One is, how did you juggle? How did you do it? You have 2 kids and a massive influential career. And 2, do you feel like being a mom had an impact on you?
For me, I tell every woman, take care of your family first. That's so important. I always said if I'm a good wife and a good mom, I'll be a good governor. If I'm a good wife and a good mom, I'll be a good ambassador. Because if life is good at home, there's nothing we can't do. instinctively, we want to take care of our kids. We want to make sure our spouses are okay. That's just what we do. And so I think it's really important that we do that. When I was governor, I didn't let my schedule dictate me. I dictated my schedule. We sat down, we had dinner as a family 5 nights a week. Sundays were off limits. Friday nights were Haley Family Fun Nights. We always did those things. And even when I was at, ambassador, you always take time for your family. Doesn't mean you don't work hard. Maybe it means staying up late more often or getting up early. But family time and that quality time really makes you good. Because when you feel that family presence, you feel like you have all the support you need to do anything. So I am a big proponent of don't think you have to choose one or the other. Choose your family first, and then watch how it empowers you to do everything else.
How lucky you are, how lucky we are that we are able to really have both, right? And I actually think it's not just luck. It's a decision that we've made, right? And that we said, well, we want to have both. I think a lot of young women are hearing that they have to choose career first and family secondary. Some people think that they can't have a career if they have children. It is doable to have both. I mean, you've done it. I do it. I think part of it is get organized with our schedule. And part of it is recognizing that every person is different and everybody has their own journey. And a lot of it is just a matter of choice.
And whatever you do, be great at it. And, look, we both have very supportive spouses. And I think that matters too, is making sure it's a partnership. I couldn't do what I do without Michael. He's that sounding board at the end of the day. He's the one that, always hears me out. He keeps me humble. He, pushes me when I need to be pushed. I think that's really important as you do that. But they also cheer you on, and want to see you do well. And I think that our kids need to see that. It's good for our kids to see the partnership. It's good for our kids to see, our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities, but also our strengths and how we push through it, because that's what they're going to eventually do.
Did you ever feel guilty that you were not at every single game or not at every single recital?
I really tried to do a lot of things. It didn't mean I went to everything, but I really focused on what was important for the kids. So if my daughter was a cheerleader, trying to get to the football games for her. If my son played basketball, trying to get to his games. If I couldn't go, my husband did. So I just made sure one of us was always making them feel loved and seen and appreciated. But then at the same time, they knew if I was traveling and I couldn't be there, that was part of my work too. And so I think it's the balance that we have to do.
You talk a lot about standing for truth and morality. That could be, in the day that we live in today, a subjective thing. Where do you get your truth from?
It's much easier to tell the truth. Life is easier when you tell the truth. I think when you try and be something you're not or say something you don't believe in, I think it shows. And I think being genuine to people, even if you know they're not going to all agree with you, it's so much better than trying to fake it.
I want to teach my girls and my son to stand for truth too. The schools that my kids go to, I happen to trust because we send them to a Jewish Orthodox school that shares our values. But if we didn't have the means and we would have to send them to a government school, a public school, they would be learning things that, in my opinion, are not truthful. And I think are legitimately not truthful, right? Within critical race theory and this revisionist history about America. But kids are growing up with lies. And so, look, what advice would you have for parents on how do you make sure that your children know the truth?
Talk to your kids. I always said that, my kids would sit on my bed and we'd talk every night. And when they stopped sitting on my bed, I started sitting on theirs. Talk to your kids and find out what they're thinking, what they're feeling. As they come to you, when they come to you and say, I don't know what to do, ask them, what do you think you should do? Like, grow them as thinkers, grow them as trusting themselves. That's really important as a parent that you do that. And then watch what's happening in school. And that's why I think that dinner table discussion is so important. Make sure you're talking about whatever is on their mind. And that's how we can help shape where they want to be, because it's a confusing time for kids. We're seeing depression at high levels. We're seeing suicidal rates at high levels. We're seeing confusion. I feel bad for anyone raising a small child right now. But what I'll tell you is don't let it happen to your child. Take control of the situation and make sure you control their destiny, not let government-run schools control their destiny.
Do you think, from your experience working in government, that there is any hope that parents like me who have little kids, that these schools are not going to continue to fail us? Is there any way that they're going to be repaired?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, go to school board meetings. That's the first thing. It's the one I think that's more important than anything else is go to school board meetings, ask the hard questions, say what you need to, pay attention to your children's curriculum. But actually, every governor in the country can decide how schools are run. When I was governor in South Carolina, I really focused on how do we lift up the rural challenged areas without bringing down the wealthy areas. And what I saw is that if a child can't read by third grade, they're 4 times less likely to graduate high school. So we passed a bill that said if they couldn't read by third grade, you'd have to hold them back. In that process, I started looking at the funding formulas. And what I found is the Department of Education in DC basically goes to states and says, if you teach this, we'll give you this much money. If you teach this, we'll give you this much money. If you teach critical race theory, we'll give you this much money. A governor can decide and say, we don't want that money. We need to start focusing on how you teach to the children and not teaching to the money, because that's what's happened in the schools. First, I think, this communist thought went into universities. Now the universities have started teaching people who become teachers, but we've got to go back in and make sure that we are leading the charge in what is being taught in our schools. Parents do have a voice. They do have the ability to move things. We've got to hold our elected officials accountable, whether it's at the school board level, whether it's at the governor's level, whether it's, in Congress. As the Department of Education makes decisions, we have to make our voices heard, because the rest of the world is looking at us going, what is going on there? I mean, it's really crazy that they know we're having these conversations and we just look so distracted.
Yeah, I think the parents are finally waking up. I remember when I first started with PragerU 11 years ago, my friends would say, oh, Marissa, you're so political, all that stuff in Washington, really, who cares, let's enjoy our lives. And now they're like, what is going on? What can we do? How do we save our children? And so I think there's a real opportunity here for parents to get involved. Their eyes are now open after the lockdowns of what has happened. They've taken a deep dive into what is happening to their kids' education, plus everything just accelerating and becoming more crazy. It is my hope that, I know many of the mama bears, I call them, follow us at PragerU and are really ready to get involved and save America. I mean, after all, we don't want to leave this country worse than how we found it for our children.
And we're seeing it all over the country. Parents are starting to take charge. They're starting to get involved. And you should. Pre-COVID, 65% of fourth graders in our country were not proficient in reading. 66% of eighth graders weren't proficient in reading or math. So we had a problem way before COVID. Now you add COVID on top of it, we've really got to take time, because if we think we've got labor issues now, what's going to happen when our kids are not graduating high school? Yeah. So we've got to take it upon ourselves to do something about it, because the government's failing our kids, and we can't let that be the answer.
I have a little favor to ask you.
Yes.
So I think that a wonderful book for every young girl in America is the one that you've written. And I told my husband last night, even though our girls are really little, I have a preemptive bat mitzvah gift that I'm going to give them when they turn 12 years old. So if you're willing to autograph one for Aaron and one for Olivia,
Absolutely.
so I can give it to them in a few years. So I have a couple of them here. So Olivia and Aaron, I have a marker.
Well, it sounds like you're raising them well.
As I say, they're going to blame me no matter what, because that's what kids do.
But they'll come back to you. They always do.
But hopefully they'll have strong characters, and we'll teach them critical thinking, and so they can make good decisions to be empowered adults eventually.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it.